Okay, so today we're diving into something pretty crucial. We're going to be looking at how arguments, particularly like moralizing arguments,
Yep.
get used in geopolitics and media analysis, and like all those big discussions about global events and how they're presented to us.
Right, yeah.
And specifically, we're going to focus this through the lens of the conflict in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a very emotionally charged situation, and there's just so much information out there. It's hard to wade through it all.
Exactly. So what we're doing in this deep dive is we're going to give you some tools, some ways to really dissect these issues by looking at the underlying arguments that are being made.
Yeah.
We're trying to get you to a deeper understanding. Our goal really is to kind of figure out how these moralistic arguments are used and maybe even misused when people talk about, global events, what's happening in the world, and how the media is portraying it all.
Right.
Especially with Ukraine.
Yeah.
We're going to try to equip you with a more critical and nuanced perspective. And, this really ties into the heart of what the Media Misleads channel is all about, which is, constantly questioning those old media power structures.
Yeah, for sure.
So the author we've been looking at starts with a really interesting observation. And that is that, a lot of liberals and mainstream media tend to default to these really emotional and moralistic arguments.
Yeah.
And what's really notable is that this isn't always about reaching a reasoned conclusion.
Right.
It's not about looking at the evidence.
Right.
It's about something else.
Yeah.
The author makes this point, I'm going to paraphrase here a little bit, but he says that there's this like almost immediate tendency to go to this moralizing, emotion-based argument.
Yeah.
And the reason they do that is because they believe that that is like the most effective way
Sure.
to argue for what they believe.
Yeah.
It's not about finding like the best argument based on the evidence.
Right.
It's more about how can I most effectively argue for what I already believe.
Right.
So they kind of start with a stance. They start with what's right and wrong,
Sure.
and then they try to build a case based on that.
Yeah, that's a good point. The author really suggests that that is a tool, whether consciously or not, to sway people, and they do that through emotion and often attacking character as opposed to dealing with facts and logic.
Right.
So that's an important point to remember, I think.
And it's very persuasive because it tugs at the heartstrings.
Yeah.
But just because you feel strongly about something
Right.
doesn't mean that it's, a logically sound argument.
Right.
And for those of you, wanting to really understand these complex issues, in a deep way and efficiently, these moralizing arguments can actually be a roadblock.
Right.
It's like a bypass to that deeper understanding because it goes straight to the emotions and not the reasoning.
Yeah, it's bypassing the sort of rational mind.
Yeah. So just to give you like a concrete example, imagine a news report that's framing one side of a conflict, say in Ukraine, as like purely heroic.
Right.
And the other side is totally villainous.
Right.
That might trigger a strong emotional response.
Yeah.
But it's probably obscuring important historical and economic factors that make the situation a lot more complex.
Right. It's not so black and white.
It's not black and white yet. If we're just focusing on good versus evil,
Right.
we're probably missing a big chunk of the picture.
Yeah. And I think that's something the author wants to point out.
Yeah, exactly. So now he zooms out a bit, to the bigger picture of how countries actually interact on the world stage.
Yeah.
And the author introduces a concept that might seem kind of harsh at first.
Yeah.
This idea that the international arena is fundamentally anarchic.
Yeah.
Meaning that there's no real power structure. There's no like global authority above nation states. So they don't really interact with each other.
Right.
The same way that like citizens within a country do.
Right. Because we have laws, we have a legal system.
Exactly.
But that doesn't exist globally.
There's no global government. There's no global police force.
Right.
There's no real way to, enforce these moral rules that we might hold within a society.
Yeah.
And that has some pretty big implications.
Yeah.
Because it suggests that ultimately each nation is primarily concerned with its own survival.
Right.
And its own interests.
Yeah.
It's like everyone's looking out for number one.
Yeah, well, that's kind of the point. It's a very, it can be a cynical worldview, but, it's certainly a perspective that's worth considering.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a pretty cold way of looking at it. But in this kind of environment where there's no one really to enforce the rules, morality itself can almost become a tool.
Right.
It's a way to try to gain some kind of advantage rather than some fixed standard that everybody follows.
Right, exactly.
And this is where the whole idea of emotions in these arguments becomes really interesting.
Yeah.
because the author argues pretty strongly that emotion really doesn't have a place in these kinds of arguments.
Right.
And neither does moralizing.
Right.
This idea that our emotions can cloud our judgment. They can distract from like a clear, rational analysis.
Right.
Especially when you're dealing with nations
Right.
that might not share the same values at all.
Sure.
They might have very different moral frameworks.
Yeah.
Or maybe even no shared values on certain issues. So when you encounter a strong emotional element in an argument, whether it's someone else's
Sure.
or even your own reaction,
Right.
it should be a sign to stop and think.
Yeah.
It might be a signal that something else is going on.
Right.
Maybe there's a deeper reason that needs to be examined.
Yeah.
There might be some weakness in the argument itself.
Yeah.
And the author even suggests, that spotting those emotional responses in others
Yeah.
can almost be like a strategic advantage,
Yeah.
in a negotiation or a debate.
Right. If someone's highly emotional, then their reasoning might be compromised.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's it's a very like kind of pragmatic, maybe even cynical lens to look at international relations through.
Yeah. And it's a good point, though. So I think that leads us nicely into the media's role in all of this. And the author definitely has strong opinions about that.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's very critical of what he calls the corporate press.
Right.
And he describes them as being like largely captured.
Yeah. Yeah.
Entities
Yeah.
that are prone to, well, I'm quoting here, outright lying or intentionally omitting crucial context.
Yeah.
And or presenting really weak arguments, character attacks.
Yeah.
Fear-mongering, that kind of stuff.
Right.
And this really aligns with the Media Misleads channel in general, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Which is to look at these power structures and to really question them.
Right. To analyze them critically.
Exactly. So it's not just about informing the public, but it's about, serving those interests
Right.
of powerful people.
Yeah.
Who are shaping the narrative.
Yeah. And sometimes those interests are aligned with what's good for the public.
Right.
But often they're not.
Exactly.
And I think that's part of the point the author's trying to get at.
Yeah. So the author brings up a couple of examples of this kind of media framing.
Yeah.
In relation to the Ukraine conflict.
Yeah.
For instance, the shifts in U.S. policy on aid to Ukraine.
Right.
He argues that these are often criticized using, you guessed it,
Moralistic
arguments.
Right.
It's always framed in terms of like good versus evil.
Yeah.
Right versus wrong.
Yeah.
Which, as we've said, tends to prevent a more nuanced understanding of what's actually going on geopolitically.
Here, it's never that simple.
Never that simple.
Okay.
You might see a shift in aid policy, and it'll be presented as abandoning a moral obligation to Ukraine.
Right.
Without really exploring, maybe the strategic reasons.
Right.
Or the economic reasons behind that change.
Sure, there's always a lot more to the story.
There's always more.
Yeah.
And to really drive this point home, the author brings up this interesting example. It's an interview with Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Where Trump says, I'm quoting here, "I just want people to stop dying."
Yeah.
Pretty straightforward statement, right?
Yeah, on the surface, yeah.
But the author says that, those who already had like a negative view of Trump immediately assumed that his motives were insincere.
Right.
Like they were trying to read his mind.
Right.
And say, oh, he doesn't really mean it.
Right.
He's just saying that for show.
Yeah.
And the author sees this as like a very common pattern.
Yeah.
This tendency to assume the worst.
Right.
About someone's intentions.
Right.
Especially mainstream media.
Yeah.
He says that often these assumptions are used to undermine someone's character.
Yeah.
And it really prevents you from engaging with what they're actually saying.
Right.
You're so busy trying to figure out what they're secretly thinking.
Yeah.
That you can't actually listen to the words.
Yeah, exactly.
And, we see this a lot online, too.
Yeah.
Especially in those, like, really heated discussions about Ukraine.
Right.
People are so quick to jump to conclusions about people's motives.
Yeah.
Without really having any, solid evidence.
Right.
And I think that brings us to a really important point that the author keeps coming back to.
Yeah.
And that's the need for nuance.
Right.
And what he calls epistemic humility.
Yeah.
Which basically means, recognizing the limits of our own knowledge.
Right.
You don't know everything.
Right.
And we can't always know why other people do what they do.
Yeah.
So we should be a little bit humble about that.
Yeah.
Because when we start attributing intentions to people without good evidence,
right.
we're likely going to end up with some pretty unfair judgments.
Yeah.
And that's going to prevent us from really understanding what's going on.
Right, exactly.
And this connects to a broader point, I think, about societal values. The author argues that even things like individualism and liberalism and social justice, seemingly positive values,
Right.
those aren't absolute.
Right.
And they need to be balanced,
Sure.
as he puts it. Even things like free markets and individual liberty, those can be taken too far.
Yeah. Freedom taken to its logical extreme is no freedom at all.
Right. So he's saying that, taking these concepts to an extreme
Yeah.
can actually weaken our ability to think critically.
Yeah.
When we become so attached to certain ideals, we become less willing to question them.
Right.
Or to really analyze, different perspectives.
Right.
And that makes us really susceptible to these moralizing arguments
Yeah.
that are just appealing to those values, but don't have a lot of substance.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, and this leads to this really thought-provoking idea about the role of religion in society.
Yeah.
The author argues that the decline of religion as a kind of shared moral foundation has actually contributed to this problem.
Right.
He says, when we lose something like Christianity or any religion as like the common ground for our moral structure,
Right.
we create a void
Yeah.
in what society considers like the highest good,
Yeah.
and something else has to fill that void.
Yeah.
And he says, often that something else is science
Right.
or the state.
Yeah.
But those things may not give us the same kind of objective moral compass.
Right.
And it leads to a more fragmented understanding of right and wrong.
Right, exactly.
And then, it becomes easier for all these different moralizing arguments
Right.
from all these different groups to kind of gain traction.
Yeah, and everybody retreats into their own echo chamber.
Exactly. And it weakens our ability to think critically
Yeah.
because we're just surrounded by people who agree with us all the time.
Right.
So bringing this back to the Ukraine conflict, the author applies this framework by questioning the moralizing stances
Yeah.
that are taken by a lot of European leaders.
Yeah.
And it's especially interesting when you consider that they're holding a significant amount of seized Russian assets.
Right.
The author mentions somewhere between $200 and $300 billion
Wow.
in seized Russian bank assets,
Yeah.
which could be, equal to all the aid that they've given to Ukraine.
Right.
So it really makes you wonder, how do these leaders square those two things?
Right.
Their strong moral stance on the conflict,
Yeah.
withholding all this money.
Yeah.
What are their real motivations there?
Yeah. What's actually going on behind the scenes?
Yeah, and it also raises this deeper question
Right.
about, the reasons behind this whole conflict.
Yeah.
The author points out that there are two kind of main competing ideas about why Putin invaded Ukraine.
Right.
One is, NATO expansion.
Right.
The other is like a desire to rebuild this like Russian empire.
Right.
And I think the author's point is that we can't really know for sure. We can speculate all we want, but we don't really know what's in Putin's head.
Yeah.
And that's an important thing to remember,
Yeah.
because the goal of, really analyzing these issues and discussing them
Yeah.
shouldn't be about like winning an argument.
Right.
It shouldn't be about being the most morally outraged.
Yeah. Yeah.
It should be about like really defending your own understanding of the world
Right.
and trying to gain a more complete picture,
Yeah, exactly.
even if it challenges your own beliefs.
Right.
It's about the pursuit of understanding,
Right.
not about being right.
Yeah. And I think that's an important distinction.
Yeah, absolutely.
So to kind of round this out,
Yeah.
the author touches on the importance of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And he's basically saying that we should be really aware of our own emotional reactions.
Right.
Like when we feel offended.
Yeah.
Instead of trying to silence other people,
Right.
we should be looking inward and asking ourselves, what's going on here? Why am I feeling this way?
Exactly. We're responsible for our own emotions.
Right.
And when we try to blame everything on external factors, we kind of give up our power.
Right.
The key is to recognize those arguments
Right.
that are specifically designed to trigger us,
Right.
to make us angry, to make us feel certain emotions.
Right.
Because that's how you maintain your critical thinking skill
Right.
and keep your confidence.
Yeah.
And the author's big takeaway here is that real strength
Yeah.
comes from emotional intelligence
Yeah.
and self-control.
Yeah.
When we understand what triggers us.
Yeah.
And we recognize, when people are trying to manipulate us with these moralizing arguments,
Right.
that's when we can really start to approach, information, especially from the media,
Yeah.
with a much more discerning eye.
Yeah.
So to sum up our deep dive today, we've been looking at how these moralizing arguments get used and potentially misused in the context of geopolitics.
Yeah.
And media analysis surrounding the war in Ukraine.
Right.
We've discussed the importance of, really understanding this anarchic nature of how nations interact.
Yeah.
The need to critically analyze those media narratives that we're constantly bombarded with.
Right.
And the value of being humble about what we know and what we don't know.
Yeah.
You know about other people's motives.
Yeah, that's a big one.
And ultimately, the power of emotional intelligence.
Yeah.
And self-control.
Yeah. And as the Media Misleads channel focuses on, we really want to equip you with the ability to think critically about the information you're encountering.
Exactly.
And to understand the power dynamics that are shaping those narratives.
Right.
Because they're always there.
Always there.
Whether we see them or not.
So here's something to ponder as we wrap up today.
Mm-hmm.
How might you approach news and discussions about the Ukraine conflict and any complex geopolitical event for that matter in a new way? Can you step back from those initial knee-jerk emotional responses?
Right.
And aim for a more nuanced understanding?
Right.
Really consider the motivations behind those narratives that you're encountering.
Yeah, that's a good one.
What are the motivations there? What information is being left out? What's the bigger picture?
Yeah, that's great stuff.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time.
See you then.